Mr. Speaker.
Holly Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For a long time now, the Green Party has spoken on bills like this to articulate what are fairly fundamental concerns about the student loan scheme per se. And those concerns relate to its fairness, they relate to the barriers in access that it creates to tertiary education. They relate to the ballooning problem of the $12 billion of student debt and growing that we face as a nation, and to the impact that that debt will have on future generations, including my own generation, in terms of our ability to have a strong financial start in life, to aspire to home ownership, to provide for our families. And indeed, we have long also articulated fundamental concerns about what the student loan scheme does to the desirability of New Zealand as a place to live for young people and as a place to return to for people who have been living overseas. And I'm sorry to say, Mr. Speaker, that this bill, while it amends the student loan scheme, addresses none of these more fundamental concerns. But worse than that, it may actually worsen them worsen the current situation in respect of some of these concerns. And I want to focus my comments in this first reading debate on two aspects in particular. The first is the fact that this bill is a missed opportunity to, while it does align the definitions of income for working for families in the student loan scheme, it actually misses the opportunity to align those in a way that would be meaningful and would actually increase fairness in terms of access to both of those schemes. And the second thing I want to focus on is the greater risk, I think, that this bill introduces in terms of data matching between customs and IRD, of actually disincentivising young New Zealanders to return to live here and to contribute. So first of all, to look at the definition of income, because that's one of the more significant changes that this bill makes to align the definitions of income for the purposes of the student loan scheme with the definition that's used in relation to working for families. And while it does that, we in the Green Party think that there's still a fundamental problem that remains unaddressed by this bill in terms of the definitions of income that are used. And this was highlighted earlier this year when the government introduced changes to increase the student loan repayment rate. And what that highlighted was that because working for families entitlements are calculated on net income before student loan repayments are taken into account or deducted, increasing the student loan repayment rate, as was done in the budget, has a real detrimental effect on many families who are working hard to make ends meet and on the weekly budgets of those families, because effectively it's a tax increase and it's not taken into account when their working for families entitlements are calculated. There was no corresponding increase in working for families entitlements, and the net result is bad for the weekly budget and for the back pockets of families with young children. And so in seeking to align these income definitions, this problem needs to be addressed. And while the bill does align the definitions, it doesn't address the fundamental problem that working for families entitlements are calculated before student loan repayment rates are taken into account. And that just entrenches and compounds the negative changes already made in the budget. Another way that the bill entrenches and compounds negative changes that have already been made, as I've outlined, is in its provisions to allow greater information sharing between customs and IRD in an effort to crack down on overseas borrowers who may have defaulted on their loans. And while we have no problem per se with measures designed to encourage overseas borrowers to keep up with their student loan repayments, we can't support punitive measures to track them down at the border unless we have corresponding enabling provisions which recognise the importance of spending time overseas, the important experience and skills that spending such time overseas can give to an individual and provide that individual, and the potential gain to New Zealand when that individual returns from their OE. Those gains are well documented, and what we don't want to do is discourage people from returning when they have spent a period of time living overseas. And that's why the repayment holiday, when it was 3 years, was such a good idea, because it allowed for for individuals to spend time overseas with a period in which they were not required to meet their student loan repayment obligations, and therefore not racking up penalties and fines that might put them off returning to New Zealand. And 3 years we thought was a good period of time to have a repayment holiday, because it recognises the reality of how long most young New Zealanders spend overseas on their OE. And we thought it was a realistic, reasonable and appropriate time frame. Now that it's been reduced to just 1 year, we have real concerns with the provisions in this bill to allow greater information sharing with Customs and IRD, because we think that the change that's already been made to the repayment holiday mean that there will effectively be a greater number of people defaulting through no particular fault of their own, because it's very difficult to meet your student loan repayment obligations while you're overseas, will be defaulting on their loans. And introducing this information sharing provision means there's a much greater chance of them being pinged with huge penalties and extra debt when they return to New Zealand. And the cumulative impact of this policy with the shortened repayment holiday and other policies that have been introduced incrementally by this government to crack down on overseas borrowers, we feel have put at real risk the decision that many New Zealanders who are living overseas have to make at some point about whether they return or not. And we want them to return in the Green Party, because I think no one could disagree that that should be a major priority for policy design at a time when we have record numbers of New Zealanders moving overseas every week. We want to make sure that those people come back, and we need to design our student loan policy to ensure that we're not creating disincentives for them to do so. And we're concerned about the cumulative impact of this bill with other changes, and that the net effect of those changes will put talented young people off returning to New Zealand and making a contribution here. Now, if the Green Party was making amendments to the student loan scheme, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to give you an idea of what a better, improved student loan scheme might look like, bearing in mind that we continue to have fundamental concerns about the existence of the scheme at all. There are ways that it could be improved. First of all, we need to guarantee that it remains interest-free, and that needs to be guaranteed for future borrowers and for borrowers who sign up to loan contracts now. That interest-free status of that loan needs to be guaranteed into the future. Secondly, it needs to be freely accessible to all, including students who are over the age of 55. And we heard, I think, a particularly upsetting example from Grant Robertson earlier in the debate of exactly how punitive that policy to remove access to student loans for students over 55 is in the context of an economy where we're seeing greater job losses and reduced opportunities for people to upskill and retrain. And what kind of life do we condemn people to if we don't allow them the opportunity to upskill and retrain at a time when they've lost their job at a midpoint in their career? Thirdly, there would be a reduced need to borrow for living costs, because student allowances would be more widely available, and they wouldn't be tested by parental income for financially independent adults who are well into their 20s and often have other adult obligations, including children. It's absurd to test their eligibility for a student allowance against their parents' income. And student allowances also would need to be reinstated for postgraduate students. And we also heard from Grant Robertson earlier about the punitive impact that that has had on postgraduate students, and the fact that they now have to borrow to meet their living costs and can't even borrow the amount that they were eligible for before, when they could receive a student allowance. Fourthly, when it comes time to repay their loan, there would be a progressive repayment scheme, so that rather than raising the repayment rate across the board as the government did in the budget earlier this year, their repayment obligations would be based on their ability to pay, because it is absurd at the moment, Mr. Speaker, that when a graduate is earning less than the full-time equivalent of a minimum wage, they have to pay 12% of their income straight back onto their student loan. Student loan repayments rate should be progressive, and they should be based on the individual's ability to pay. And finally, as I mentioned earlier in my contribution, income definitions should be aligned not in the way that this bill does, but so as the impact of the student loan repayment doesn't negatively impact on the budgets of young families. And until we see a student loan amendment bill that makes these kind of amendments, the Green Party will oppose the government's punitive tinkering with the student loan scheme and oppose this bill.
Kanwal Bakshi.
Mr. Speaker,